Welcome, everyone, to Democracy Tomorrow. I am Nathan Wainwright, the editor of the Democracy Tomorrow show. I'm taking the reins today to speak to the host, Scott Leckie, about his most recent book and first novel, Killionaire. The blurb here says, Harry made his billions founding a social media company. Helmut in mining, Lawrence in tainted soft drinks, Jasper in weapon manufacturing, and William in destroying virgin forests. They loved being part of the global 0.0003% and were used to getting what they wanted when they wanted until now. Everyone else knew the billionaires needed to be stopped in their tracks if the planet and its people were to have a future worth living. Enter the Killionaire. So I'm excited to talk to Scott today about this book and to introduce you to what this book is about. So, Scott, you are an international human rights lawyer, author, and founder of several global organizations working on housing rights, climate displacement, and human rights. You've worked in more than 80 countries, advised numerous United Nations agencies, and helped develop over 100 international human rights standards, resolutions, and principles. What inspired you to write Killionaire? And what, in your experience, motivated you to write this book?
Well, throughout my life, I always had in the back of my mind that I would one day write a novel, or at least try to write a novel. Um, I've written so many other books, and they're very technical and legal, and require sometimes literally thousands of footnotes, and very much for small academic, legal, human rights audiences. And I thought it would be fun to explore the possibility of writing novels. I love reading novels. I've read thousands of novels. I'm always reading at least three or four at the same time. And so, once you've read a huge number of novels, you begin to start noticing patterns and trends in terms of how to put a novel together. Because it's not easy, by all means, not easy. Um, but it started kind of dawning on me that I could do that. I'm going to do that. So I sort of had that thought process going on, and then I thought, well, what's an interesting story to try to put into a novel? And the older I got and the more that I worked, the more I realized that you know some people will read things that you write if you write political oriented documents or legally oriented documents and books. Um, but the vast majority of people won't. But they might read a novel talking about the very same things. So because it's fun and because it's a thriller and it's an adventure story and all of that, might grab people that wouldn't normally read either my books or Oxfam reports or reports by other analysts and everything else. And I could think of very few themes in the world today that were more zeitgeisty in nature than the question of billionaires and billionairism. And, you just simply have to look across the world, read the newspaper any given day, watch the news, listen to the radio any given day, and you will hear countless stories directly mentioning billionaires or indirectly mentioning billionaires and the companies that they own, the policies that they pursue, the political parties that they're backing, and the list goes on. So I thought let's try to write a story. There is a movement now underway globally, growing rapidly, which is beginning to ask whether all these billionaires is such a good thing, and whether it's actually undermining democracy and promoting a structural inequality at levels that the human race has never before experienced. It's important to remember that even the poorest billionaire, the one who has $1,000,000,001, and there's a lot of billionaires that have a lot more than that, but the poorest billionaire is 125,000 times more wealthy than the median person on planet Earth, who's right in the middle of half are poorer than him or her, half are richer than him or her. 125,000 times. It's almost impossible to even conceive of that. So, do we want to continue with this world? Is this the world that's really going to yield the best results? Is this the world that we consider one that all of us can best flourish in and prosper in? And I think increasingly people are realizing that it's not like that. So I thought, why not write a satirical outlandish, thriller, fun, kind of out of control novel that looks both at the possibility of creating a utopia, which also everybody has dreamed about at some point in time or another in their life. What if we had a utopia? Why doesn't utopia ever happen? Well, I decided to write about a utopia that did happen and that succeeded and spread like wildfire across the planet. That everyone was ready for it. And they kept growing and growing until it reached the point where their growth stopped and no one really knew why. And then they isolated it down after a series of meetings and discussions to the billionaires. So, this otherwise very law abiding, very human rights protecting utopian society called Pacifica comes up with the idea that they need to find a way to reduce the power of the billionaires. And then new forces are unleashed. And that's the second two-thirds of the book about the Pacifica versus the billionaires, essentially. And so the Pacifica idea um, is part of a 7 novel series that I'm writing now. So I've written the first 2. The second one is called Psychotic Despotic, and that's all about dictators, another interesting class of humans. The third one is about the fossil fuel industry and climate change. I've already begun that one. And then the next 4 will come after that. So it's a series. The protagonists, the good guys, are always the same in each of the 7 books. And each time they go after one particular class of humans that I would see as uh, highly responsible for some of the most negative developments in the world today.
I'm curious. So with this book, The Killionaire, in your media release, it says this isn't simply a critique of the world that is, but it's also an attempt to imagine what comes next. And you wanted to create a world that you would like to see, one in which all humans are treated as equal members of the human family. In what way do you see the billionaire class as being antithetical to that worldview?
Well, today in mid 2026, there's around 3,400 billionaires out of 8.2 billion people. So it's this tiny group of people. They could physically fit within a large house standing up. Um, it's not like it's tens of millions of people or anything like that. It's a tiny coterie of people, all of whom are much more at home with each other than they are with citizens of their own country or people that grew up in the same culture as they. There is a specific class of humans who all know each other, who all work together in various ways to create circumstances that are highly beneficial to themselves and not necessarily to the rest of humanity. And when you reach that level of privilege and that level of power and control, you can already see, just look at the papers today, they're very much reaching their tentacles as deeply as they ever have into the political spheres of countries across the world. Governments are backed by billionaires. Elections are changed by billionaire donations. Billionaires are writing policies and getting their own supported politicians to get them through national parliaments. The list goes on and on and on. And it's very clear that there's kind of a direct relationship between the strength of democracy and the existence of the billionaire class, which is increasingly trying to create structures that ensure their prolongation, that ensure that no wealth taxes will be created, for instance, to ensure that there will never be a limit to the amount of wealth that one individual person can have, to ensure that their involvement within politics can remain in place for forevermore. But I think there are, very convincing arguments to say, for instance, either you get rich or you enter politics, but you don't do both. There are very convincing arguments that there should be a limit on the amount of individual wealth any individual person can have. And, some people are saying now that it should be 10 million euros. Other people are saying 38 million US dollars. There's a variety of suggestions on the table right now, but the debate is already underway. What is it? In what moral or ethical universe can you ever imagine a situation whereby 8 people 8 of the richest billionaires have more wealth among them than the poorest half of humanity. I mean, this is a staggering thing. And we need to look at the big picture. It's not just a little picture question, it's a big picture question. The average billionaire releases 1 million times more CO2 than the average person and simply gets away with it. The average billionaire could not even spend all the money they had if they wanted to. They're making so much new money all the time just on the basis of the capital they hold. They couldn't even possibly spend it all before they died. So I could go on and on in terms of the details about why, this is a question that needs to be discussed and debated. Some will say that, but billionaires created all these companies, but billionaires give all these people jobs, but billionaires are so innovative and they invented this and they invented that and they should be able to benefit and so on and so forth. Well, that may be true to a certain degree, but there are very convincing arguments that would say something to the effect that we need a limit on wealth. No company should be able to pay the CEO more than a certain multiple of what the poorest worker in the company makes, the lowest paid worker. Now you have tens of thousands of times more income going to the top than the lowest level in many companies. You know, it should really be something closer to 10 or maybe 12 or maybe 15. And you have to live with it. Like, there's nothing to say that wealth should be endless and infinite. If there were safeguards that protected the systems against abuse by those with enough resources to sway the system, well, then maybe you can make arguments. But we're nowhere near that now. We're nowhere even close. And it's even happening, it's obvious in the United States where there are approximately 1,000 billionaires, the degree to which they control so much of the political purse strings there, unlimited ability to make financial contributions to political campaigns, for instance, as a form of freedom of speech. They call it, according to the Citizens United Supreme Court decision. But it's even happening in Australia, where the richest Australian person gave an airplane to the leader of the extreme right wing party here, and the list goes on. So, you know, ordinary people need to ask themselves whether it's truly beneficial to society at large if such a tiny group of people can have so much political and economic power. And, I try to explore those things in a fun and easy to access way in the book and show that, there is a real danger in letting people who have a certain amount of resources do whatever they want because it's not always in the public interest. We still have a majority planet who are poor. Most people, most places in the world are essentially one paycheck away from poverty. We're talking about 5 to 6 billion people who are barely scraping by. And then you have this other class at the other extreme who can do anything, anywhere, anytime, and pollute as much as they want, consume as much as they want, control the political levers of power in an increasing number of countries whenever they want, dictate this, dictate that. And, in the end, that's going to really create a problematic scenario for our civilization as a whole. And that's why I sort of addressed that theme in Killionaire. Well, maybe it's time to start thinking about organizing ourselves in a different way whereby we were all truly treated as equals. I mean, that's the basic fundamental premise of all human rights laws and everything else. We are equal. We should be equal in law and policy and most of all in practice, and we're not equal anymore.
I'm curious to hear about the world that you did create in Killionaire. So you mentioned before Pacifica. So Pacifica is the basis of the series of 7 books that you are writing, and Killionaire is the first of those 7. Can you give us a bit of insight into the world that you have created? What is Pacifica, and what does Killionaire introduce us to this world?
Well, you know, I've been very lucky to have visited pretty much, not every corner of planet Earth, but quite a few, and to have worked in more than 80 countries and to be very familiar with pretty much every single prevailing cultural group or religious group or racial or ethnic group or political group all across the world. And if I've ever come to any conclusion that, I know I will never change, it's simply that in the first instance, we are all the same. Doesn't matter where we're from, doesn't matter who our parents were, what religion we were born with, where we grew up. We're all essentially the same. Um, that people are essentially good wherever you go in the world. People are kind, people are generous, people are hospitable and welcoming. They love to laugh, they love to share what they have. People are essentially really good hearted, and it's circumstances that are generally imposed upon them that can make them act in ways that are not so great. And there's far too much of that going on.
Mm.
Um, and then also, of course, the word utopia in its very origins is a place that cannot exist. That's the actual definition of utopia. And I believe exactly the opposite. I mean, if you take an upper middle class family in the richer countries in the world today, they're essentially living a utopian life. If you were to look back at history throughout all of the 250,000 years of human history, if you're living somewhere in, New York City and have a decent income, you're living a utopian reality. There's nothing impossible about utopia. And I will always believe that. And then there are tiny utopias all over the place, you know? So I thought I would explore the idea of, you know, we're now coming to the end of this 80-year cycle, right? Where the Second World War ended in 1945, a whole new international structure was created. History tends to flow in these 80-year patterns. We're right at the end of that 80-year pattern now. Clearly, when you look at the world, we have growing authoritarianism, we have growing concentration of wealth, we have democracy under threat, we have ugly phenomenon like racism and anti-immigration policies and stuff like that popping up all over the place. Clearly people are beginning to start searching for the next phase. Are we all going to just go down the hill and all become part of authoritarian societies backed either by totalitarian regimes or the billionaire class? Or are we going to actually give people back the power that they're meant to have in the first place and have a world that's truly democratic, truly equitable? Doesn't mean it's communist. It doesn't mean it's totalitarian. It doesn't mean it's, Leviathan looking over us. It just means that we all participate in this single polity. And the Pacifican idea is essentially premised on that. We are all the same. Let's build a new society on the ashes of, not on the ashes in this case, on the declining elements of the current civilization, and try to create something where we learn as much as we can from the past, build something new that's much more equitable, much less materialistic, much more based on, community and basic levels of assurance in terms of food and housing and healthcare and income, and treat people across the world as you yourself would want to be treated. And that's essentially the ethos of Pacifica. And in the book, and hopefully one day in the real world, um, it's an idea that suddenly takes off like wildfire because everybody's ready for something new, because the old system had its great elements, but it's clearly not enough for the world of today. And so something has to happen. Either we go down this hill where AI controls everything, where surveillance states are the norm, where you have no individual privacy or freedom anymore, where this tiny group of humans controls all political decision making, or a much better one, which is democracy is global. We all have the ability to vote. We have a government that governs the entire world as equal citizens who are accountable. The politicians in that world are totally accountable to the vote of the people, not to their own whims and wishes, and which is designed to ensure for once that the entire human race has all of their basic needs met, has all of their basic rights met, and where the militarism of today, the illegal invasions of today, the illegal occupation of other people's land of today, the violence and the brutality and the war crimes and the crimes against humanity and all the other stuff that's going on a daily basis as we speak are no longer there because people have evolved to a certain level where that simply doesn't happen anymore. That's not part of a evolutionary step forward the last 10 years where all of these things happen. Those are evolutionary steps backwards. And yes, at the end of every evolutionary cycle, you always have a period of chaos and tumult and instability as people are holding on to the old system, unable to let go of it to allow the new system to be built. And we're probably in the middle of one of those right now. And so, what's the vision that we can fight for and look forward to, fight peacefully for, and encourage people to embrace? And that's kind of what Pacifica stands for. And it happens to start on two islands in Tonga, two real islands. They're called Tofua and Cow, and those are real islands in the chain of islands that make up Tonga. And that's where it all starts. And it's a blissful place. Only 10,000 people live there initially, and vibes are good. And everything's built out of natural materials, and it's all organic farming. They developed their own solar plane so they can fly around the world at no ecological cost. And they do all this, really forward leaning, cutting edge technologies. Like they drill into the volcano that's on Cow and create energy out of it. They harness the geothermal energy from the molten that's going to come out through the volcano, and all sorts of stuff like that. And it's not perfect, and it doesn't mean there's no conflict or anything like that. But it's really like it's a realistic stab at what a so-called utopian society could look like. But they're engaged with the rest of the world too. So little Pacificas start popping up everywhere. There's a little one in a neighborhood in Tokyo, and then one happens in Milan, and then one happens in Sao Paulo, and then another one happens, somewhere in Australia, and they start growing and growing, and you see Viva Pacifica, Viva graffiti all over the place, and people just want to be Pacifican because they want a new and better future. They want to look forward to something and not get all depressed and angry like so many people are now. They want to look forward to something, much better for themselves and their children and, 7, 10, 20 generations down the line. And that's the way we need to, start thinking now, that we're depleting the earth as if it's this never-ending source of raw materials and natural resources, and it's very finite. It's very, very finite, the planet we live on. More than 1/4 of all land in the world today is considered degraded land officially. And we have completely exploited the hell out of this place, and it's all we got. So it's pressing those buttons as much as I can in the context of developing this alternative vision of the world.
Well, I know I'm certainly looking forward to reading Killionaire front to back, uh, and seeing what you have to say and what the story reveals. So what's next? You mentioned Psychotic Despotic. That's part 2 of the Pacifica series. Can you give people a little bit of a glimpse into what that book's gonna be about?
Yeah, sure. So it follows on the heels of Killionaire, and is based very much on how Killionaire plays itself out, shall we say. And the next challenge that the Pacificans take on is how to deal with this phenomenon of dictatorships and autocracies and authoritarian regimes. There's about 79 authoritarian regimes in place right now in the world today, containing about half of the human race. Some people would say even more. This is a real thing. This is not fiction. But I thought it's such a huge issue, and there are so many people working on it in different ways. I have very good friends that have literally, as lawyers, gone after former dictators and prosecuted them, and other dictators are, indicted already at the International Criminal Court. There's a lot of stuff going on in the real world. Revolutions tend to happen when there's a dictatorship who's weakened and the people wanting to regain, the power that they should justly have. The list goes on. So yeah, psychotic despotic is a very, very intense tale of Pacifica trying to find ways to uh, tackle this problem through using the United Nations in a very creative way, and involving lawyers, involving all sorts of the otter characters from Killionaire, and It has a very, very shocking ending, shall we say, which I will not tell you about. But it builds up slowly. It deals with the crucial issues facing humanity today, which is essentially: do we want a democratic future for everyone, or do we want to allow autocracy to prevail? And you choose. And so it's in essence, this entire book is a battle between democracy and autocracy. And it obviously takes an outlandish, satirical, sometimes hopefully to readers hilarious series of turns that hopefully help the reader to contemplate that question themselves. What role can they themselves play in building a more democratic world in which all of us are treated as equals, instead of one where dictators are able to do whatever they want within the confines of their own territory, often involving some of the most heinous crimes you could ever think of. And who wouldn't want a world without dictators if given the choice? And so that's essentially the basic parameters of the story.
Well, I look forward to that being released later in the year. Thank you for all your work. And is there anything else you would like to share before we wrap up today?
Well, I forgot to say that the third book in the series, which I'm working on right now, the second one's done. It'll be published on the 4th of November, so that's coming soon. That's called Drain. And it is, whereas the first one deals with billionaires and the second with dictators, this one deals with the fossil fuel industry, climate change deniers, and what the Pacificans can do to prove that an ancient myth that is told throughout the centuries, in contrast to all other ancient myths, Bigfoot, Yeti, the little people, leprechauns, unicorns, munchkins. In contrast to all of those, this myth is actually true. And I won't say what the myth is, but the myth is true. And they set out to find a particular location. Um, and maybe they find it, maybe they don't. But it's ultimately about how climate change can be tackled, how it was caused, who the guilty parties are, and justice plays a big role in this. But even more importantly, how to create a new world in which climate change is no longer the issue that it is today.
Okay, a little teaser for everyone. Well, I'm sure the listeners probably have more questions than answers today. If you are interested in hearing more about Scott's thinking around Killionaire and related topics, he's just recently done a series of podcasts with several channels. I'll link those on the show notes here, so feel free to have a look there and listen to some longer form podcast conversations with Scott. Killionaire, Scott, where can people find your book to purchase?
Any and every online bookstore in the world, you can find a way to get Killionaire if you want to.
Fantastic. So in other words, just Google Killionaire by Scott Leckie or use whatever search engine you use and you'll find it. We'll leave a link to Scott's website as well in the show notes, which can take you to an avenue to purchasing the book. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Scott, for taking the time today to provide a insight into Killionaire, and look forward to speaking to you again soon.